trick ourselves into thinking it's fancy.
Yeah, we aim just below fancy here. So, so Steve, thank you for volunteering. I mean, you were kind of voluntold into this, but
I'm glad to be here.
We are definitely interested in what you've been working on, and you know, it's TameFlow is one of those things where I suppose I've been waiting for the authoritative source to hear the ins and outs, and I wasn't sure where to go for it. But now you're here, so we can just ask you directly.
Yeah,
I got a starter thing here. So I always love to hear what's the passionate why behind this. What drove you to be like, I'm gonna do this thing and I feel really strongly about this? What was the why?
Well, I don't know if you know about the story of TameFlow, where it comes from, the history, because that's where you'll find explanation. I've been around for quite a while. I started off as a software engineer, believe it or not, in the previous millennium, the stone age of the field almost. And I started off in this legendary company that was Borland, the makers of Turbo Pascal and Sidekick, you know, those legendary products in the mid 80s, early 90s. Those products were outstanding, well, for many reasons, but in particular for performance. Turbo Pascal was called Turbo because it was incredibly speedy. And it was not only the products that were high performing, it was the entire organization. It was a culture of high performance. And when I left the place, in all other places where I ended up, everything was just so slow and so dragging and so depressing. So I kind of set out to understand or figure out what was it that made that place so exceptional. And that set me up for a long journey that eventually became like TameFlow. So it was that priming in the early years of my career of being obsessed by performance that gave me like the motivation to do this.
And so do you feel like, well, I'm kind of curious about what was the delta? Did you discover the delta between the high performance that you were witnessing at Borland and all the other environments that you saw? What were the main kind of causal factors behind that difference?
Well, I was lucky, so to say, that this goes back to the roots, some of the roots of Scrum, that in those years, Jim Coplin, also known as Cope, was working with AT&T, and he was tasked to figure out what made software organizations some better than others. And he studied many, amongst which Borland itself. And there, one team stood out. It was like an outlier on all charts. In any way you were trying to measure these organizations, Borland was just way out of an outlier. So what is the connection here? That Coplin did this study in a very peculiar way, not as a process engineer, not as a software engineer, but it took a completely different direction and approached the issue from like a sociological, anthropological perspective. At the time, he was not yet using what he then became known for, and that is the patterns of organizational design. But he had started this study by modeling the companies by using CRC cards, classes, responsibility, collaborators. I don't know if you're familiar. They were like precursor to object-oriented programming and domain-driven design. And with those cards, he was capturing the connections between people. So modeling, in a way, the social networks between people. And that set me off in studying, you know, that dimension. And that's where I picked up, as it was forming, the thinking with patterns. So all of TameFlow is based on patterns. And that study of that team, QuattroPro for Windows, is also very significant, because that is what inspired Jeff Sutherland to pick up the stand-up meeting, the Scrum Master role, and the product owner role. Not many people know about this, but if you check out the papers of Sutherland, the early papers, it's mentioned very clearly. But anyway, no, that work by Coplin set me off in the direction of looking at patterns, and all of TameFlow is built on the basis of pattern theory and pattern languages. So to answer your question, when you start looking at organizations in terms of patterns, what clearly stands out is the social structure, the way people communicate, the way people interact, how they make decisions together. And as a matter of fact, now in TameFlow, I have 3 foundational patterns. They were first identified by Coplin himself, but I put them like at center stage. One is inspired leadership. Note inspired, not inspiring, a subtle but important difference. And then there's the unity of purpose pattern, and finally the community of trust. So TameFlow is based on these 3 patterns, and what also becomes very important is that they, even though they might sound as very, how can we say, like declared valuable elements that typically would find like in mission statements, that somewhat also mirror what you have in the Agile Manifesto. In reality, they have none of that intent, because these patterns are not declarations of intents. They are effects that need to be caused. So they are like the end state, not what you start from. And this also distinguishes TameFlow and my thinking from what you see in the Agile world, where you have these like manifestos, which at a certain point become like declarations of moral standing, which is a very negative thing, in my opinion, because it creates like a Manichaean division between the old bad ones and the new good ones. And in that division, in that divisiveness, you lose the opportunity for getting people to work together, which is the foundational the mechanism for high-performing organizations. Anyway, you have to stop me with questions, because otherwise, you know, I'll just go on and on.
Understood. I feel that way myself when I'm on a topic that I'm passionate about. But that's helpful. I really, I think that this, if I'm hearing correctly, that these 3 patterns are almost vision statements, or you know, they're almost like outcomes rather than a directional guidance of you know, do this or don't do this. It's sort of like we want, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm reading, we want inspired leadership, we want unity of purpose, we want community of trust, whether we have it now or not. and we probably don't. We aspire to those things. Is that correct?
You could see it that way, that they are like aspirational, and then you figure out how to get there. But it's not necessarily like that. It's not necessarily like that. It's that you might start off with much more humble objectives or outcomes. I know you like that word a lot, the outcomes. Much more humble ones, which though are constructive, they are additive. You do one thing and the other and the other, and at the end, these patterns come into being. So like community of trust. I mentioned before the agile standpoint, where you have the manifesto, which I see as a divisive document, not as a uniting document. And if you start working out reasons for which you have conflicts inside the organization, and you start addressing those conflicts one after the other systematically, eventually you will be able to reduce the level of conflictuality to very low levels, and in some cases even eradicate conflicts. And what have you created then? You have created people that work together. They focus their energies on producing value for their markets, for the customers, rather than fighting one another. Now, one example you find in all companies, budgeting. Budgeting is warfare. Now, I have to get the piece of the cake, and the bigger the better. The bigger mine is, the lesser you have. So it's structural, institutionalized conflict, and that's something that just eats away, erodes the possibility of having like a community of trust and working all together.
Okay. So, and then, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I'm reminded by, flow is so constraint oriented. Do you see these kind of objectives? I want to use the right word to frame them, so you can correct me. And I didn't pick it up in what you said, but I will learn it by the end of this conversation. Do you see that those sort of conflicts or mechanisms that drive wedges or pull people in different directions based on incentives as constraints to be focused on in order to get closer to those patterns or to emulate those patterns?
Now, you've used two words there, flow and constraint, which in TameFlow have a very precise meaning. Well, first to answer your question of the constraint as maybe something that you would take from Kinefin with like enabling constraints and things that force you to think beyond the current state. That's not how I see constraints, but I understand the concept, and I would say no, that's not what we're working with. In the evolution of TameFlow, like in the beginning of the 2000s, like 2002 and 2003, I came across David Anderson's book, Software Engineering Management. I don't remember the full title, but it was the first book that connected theory of constraints to software engineering. And I have a long story to tell you about that, but long story short, nowadays, the constraint as understood in the theory of constraints is what I refer to with the word constraint. And this is a very important topic because it's fundamental for flow as well. Now, getting to flow, TameFlow has this name, Tame the Flow, as it was originally, because I work with 4 flows. One is the one that you probably are most familiar with. It's the operational flow, basically how to get stuff done and out to the customer. But I also work with a financial flow. So how the company actually makes money. And I work with the flow of information, informational flow. That's also part of lean thinking, how the top communicates to the bottom and vice versa. So the feedback loops that have to exist at all levels. And finally, but not least, and it's the most difficult flow to master, it's the psychological flow. And as you posted on the Slack, as you know, a few days ago, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the granddaddy of psychological flow, passed away. You know, I thought that was a very sad moment, because all his teachings have been so fundamental in that fourth flow of TameFlow, the psychological flow. So yeah, that's the definition of terms, what flow means for TameFlow, and what the constraint is for TameFlow. It's from TOC.
And so working across all four flows, where you find constraint seems like a massive job. How do you approach this? Is this a multi-year journey for every organization? Is there a process that you go through systematically, or is it really just like, where do you start, I guess, is the question that I'm most curious about with that, because it seems like a big job, even one of those flows, right?
It can seem overwhelming, but this is where TOC has some amazing lessons, like this notion of inherent simplicity. You've probably heard Al Shalaway blogging about that, posting on LinkedIn and talking about, because it's a really powerful concept. It might be hard to understand what it means and how to apply it, but if you get it, then even these difficult situations can turn out to be really simple. I can just cite my master case, my major case, which was with an automotive component manufacturer in Germany, where they had 4,500 engineers. The whole unit was 8,000 people, but the engineering part was 4,500, 120 teams, global. The workload was expressed in 70,000 change requests per month. So imagine that, 70,000 items in your backlog, new items every month. And long story short, the constraint was found in the operational flow, which was to be expected. Once found, it was a matter of running 2 one-week-long workshops with one team of 25 people out of 4,500. And then within just a few weeks, the overall performance went up by 40%. So these are that's the potential you have when you're working with a constraint. Now, how you find that? Now, that's really the secret sauce. That's where I think TameFlow, my work, stands out. That is the contribution that I have come up with to this industry. Because if we go back to David Anderson and his book on using TOC in software, well, how can we say this? He failed to do that. That's why he came up with Kanban, the Kanban method. And I remember very clearly having conversations with him at a conference, and he said, it's impossible to find the constraints in knowledge work. But that's what I've done.
Well, that I think is that's a great place to leave it. Unfortunately, we have to leave it, but I think that's a great place to leave it, because I think Finding the constraint in knowledge work is something that we could dig into in a future conversation for sure, and I would love to. This has given me a lot of perspective. I'm sure this just scratches the surface. So in 10 seconds, can you point us to where folks should start if they're interested in finding out more about TameFlow? Because I'm going to follow the link myself.
So to get like the basics, it's the book that I published in 2014-15, Hyperproductive Knowledge Work Performance. That you get like the background, but to get the more up-to-date thinking, especially for the operational flow, it's the draft book I have on LeanPub. Just go on leanpub.com/TameFlow and you find that. It's all in a state of draft, so it's being worked on. Unfortunately, I'm in a period that I have very little time, but it's like over 90% done. So the meat is there. Maybe it's not polished, and the copy editing process and illustration has to be perfected. But you will see how you can find the constraint in a situation like the one I described before.
Beautiful. Thank you. Really appreciate this. Wow. Fantastic.
My pleasure.
On a a last minute sprung on you topic tour, we really appreciate it.